Victory isn't simply the unmasking of the hood, but defeating those who rule it. This is 19.
In the year 1919 in particular, and the years prior, there was much tyranny that the black people experienced at the hands of white suppressors. But it was the case in this particular year that the black people decided no more. And as oftentimes is the case, when our community experiences tyranny at the hands of the oppressor goes to great lengths to frame the narrative. So much so in calling our response to his tyranny a riot, when in actuality it's not a riot at all. What it happens to be is sedition, subterfuge, insurrection, revolt, treason, retribution, incursion, encroachment, and a reckoning. The case is that something that's incendiary, that we take it upon ourselves to be retaliatory.
To date, we've welcomed you to 19. Let's examine 19 a little bit closer. Here we find ourselves 100 years removed from the incidents that happened a century ago. Where do we find ourselves as a nation, as a culture, politically, economically, socially? What we're going to do at this time is look at all those factors in much more detail. In fact, in a number of the places where all these riots occurred, there were some common denominators. But there were also some specificities that we're going to look at in much more detail right now.
If We Must Die is the poem that makes me a poet among colored Americans. If we must die, let it not be like hogs, hunted and penned in an inglorious spot, while round us bark the mad and hungry dogs, making their mock at our accursed lot. If we must die, oh, let us nobly die, so that our precious blood may not be shed in vain. Then even the monsters we defy shall be constrained to honor us though dead. O kinsmen, we must meet the common foe. Though far outnumbered, let us show us brave, and for their 1,000 blows deal one death blow. What though before us lies the open grave? Like men, we'll face the murderous, cowardly pack, pressed to the wall, dying but fighting back.
Until now, we've been shown litany of those who've been getting their ass kicked. But at 19, they turned the page, and they began to kick ass. You're going to learn today. So as often as we've seen time and time again that weapons that were used on us or against us, in this instance, the tide was turned. And we took upon ourselves to arm ourselves against the tyranny that was inflicted upon us, to go about and do what needed to be done. And if I may say so, handle our business.
The year is 1919, and many incidents occurred in this particular year that provoked a black response to the tyranny that they had suffered. It was coast to coast, and the occasions in which these things and places in which these things took place were numerous. But countless times and time again, black people took arms and defended themselves in the streets and the courtrooms. The case of 19 was by James Weldon Johnson, labeled as Red Summer. But here we find ourselves 100 years removed in similar like fashions to what they found themselves. But this generation responded differently. Just to cite one of the instances that occurred in 1919, and there were many, at least 25 recorded riots took place in that calendar year. But we are definitely of the opinion that there were many more that never were recorded. This was one instance that happened. After the war, whites at Big Buckhead Church kicked out the black attendees who had been worshiping with them in an integrated church for a number of years. A member of the church, Judge Porter W. Caldwell, gave the black congregants 2 acres to build their own church. They so did, and even gave him the honor of naming their church Carswell Grove Baptist Church. During 1919, in the heat of many of the things that escalated to the violence that would define that year, that very church that they had been given the land to erect was attacked. And many of the acts of violence on this particular night, white mob with guns charged the Carswell Grove Baptist Church, firing as they came. Congregants jumped through the windows and took off to the woods. Mothers threw their children out the windows and ran shortly and scrambled there behind them. The mob torched the building, and smoke and flames could be seen well into the dusk of that evening. The very church that they had been excommunicated from attending to build their own church for alleged white benevolence was attacked by the people who used to sit next to them in the very pews in which they vacated. citing some incidents that occurred across the nation in 1919. For instance, in Washington, D.C., whites packed into cars drove into black neighborhoods in northwest Washington and fired at passers-by. They drove by shooting the drive-by shootings known as a slang term as terror cars. Until Monday morning, white mobs dominated the rioting, with little coordinated resistance from blacks. That changed about 11 a.m. when 4 black men in a terror car sped past the Navy Hospital in southeast Washington. They opened fire on the sentry and patients walking the grounds. The men were arrested, but news spread blacks were fighting back. They complained whites in the District of Columbia, Washington, D.C., were buying revolvers during the day, but blacks were not allowed to do so. But, as it were, blacks approached other blacks who happened to have connections in Baltimore and went to Baltimore to purchase and retrieve guns to bring back to D.C. so they can defend themselves. At the attempts that blacks went to the authorities to solicit protection for their homes, neighborhoods, and families and were denied, they left the meeting saying, "Very well, if you can't protect us, we will arm and defend ourselves." 3 hours afterwards, Negroes were shooting and beating up their oppressors. As many as 500 pistols were sold just on that particular day, but all to white patrons. Black people being refused the opportunity to purchase firearms or weapons went to greater lengths to secure these items, and in so doing, they had to go out of town to do so. Black men by the thousands gathered in the streets of their neighborhoods waiting. Both sides were armed with razors, pistols, clubs, bats, pipes, bricks, and knives. Black men set up barricades on streets around Howard University and LaDroit Park neighborhood. Some black men, a few of them were veterans, manned rooftops with rifles. Another such occurrence that happened in Washington, D.C., a black teenage girl, Carrie Minor Johnson, fatally shot 29-year-old Detective Sergeant Harry Wilson. Johnson was hiding under her bed when Wilson broke down the door to her second bedroom. Police were responding to reports that a sniper fired from the building into the street. Johnson said she shot Wilson in self-defense. Police called her a girl sniper. Just east of the Capitol, William Laney, 25, had just taken his girlfriend home from the theater. Upon doing so, he was chased by a white mob. He fired 3 shots into the crowd and killed a white teenager named Kenneth Crawl and responded, "I fired to protect myself." Police charged Laney with manslaughter. Initial accounts claimed that he was a black radical. Police said they found Laney's pockets, in which he threatened to kill the governor of Mississippi and Georgia if they did not stop lynching. These assertions later were proven to be false. Much as the case, if there isn't an actual case, they'll make one up. In Baltimore, the police marshal warned all gun shops to restrict sales until the Washington situation was over. As the riots consumed Washington, fighting broke out at the naval port of Norfolk, Virginia, after blacks tried to stop white policemen from arresting a black soldier. Norfolk was supposed to be celebrating that day with a parade for black troops returning from France. Instead, police and sailors and Marines patrolled the streets. So what was deemed to be a day of celebration upon the return of the soldiers, due to the insightful acts of the powers that be and the police, turned into a volatile situation in which blacks responded in defense of themselves. For each incident and occasion where white brutality was perpetuated against black citizenry, in city after city, black people took up arms and defended themselves. Much as the case as we just mentioned, of specific cases, but these were not just limited to one incident here nor there. In fact, there was a collective consciousness and a collective mindset that whenever such tyranny was perpetuated against us as a people, we made the determination, this will not stand. Many such great instances of black valor and black heroics history has attempted to silence. But as we have found in honoring those people from that era with this film, those people had the self-determination, and above that the self-love, to determine that they would be victims no more. And early on, they knew there was a difference between being the victim and the victor. And we find ourselves 100 years removed, needing to employ the same tenacity, brilliance, and courage of that of our foreparents. Because though the calendar has changed, you will be hard-pressed to believe that the times have changed. And things only change when change agents bring about the change. On May 25th, a 70-year-old black steward of his church, named Barry Washington, was lynched in Milan, Georgia, after he came to the defense of two young black girls who were being harassed by two drunken white men, John Dowdy and Lewis Evans. The men attacked the girls' house late at night, brandishing weapons and demanding that they open the door. The girls ran to Brother Barry Washington's house for protection. Washington, the steward at his own church, came out with his shotgun, killed one of the men in a gun battle. Washington turned himself in to the sheriff the night after the shooting. A mob of 75 to 100 pulled him from his jail cell, hanged him from a post, and then shot his corpse to pieces. No one was ever tried. No one was ever arrested. And they walked scot-free from the justice of men. But they can't escape the justice of God. With progressive black activism in the early 1900s, black people made determinations to purchase homes where they want, open businesses where they want, and live the life of true citizens that they are entitled to live. Bishop John Hurst, a well-known preacher of the African Methodist Church and bishop for Florida, told an excited crowd at the Cleveland Armory that blacks should reject those who counsel patience until through some providence relief comes. No, my friends, we shall trust God, of course, but we are going to do some fighting too. We will fight, we will die if need be, for what belongs to us, no matter how long the delay for it to come. We will fight. Bishop John Hurst, African Methodist Church. Renaissance man Paul Robeson spoke of the new idealism. Robeson declared to a white audience, "We of this less favored race realize that our future lies chiefly in our own hands. On ourselves alone will depend the preservation of our liberties and the transmission of them in their integrity to those who will come after us." The late, great Paul Robeson. Claude McKay, a poet and artist of his time, penned a poem that went down in history that surmises what he thought should be the response of the brutality that we experienced. The following is Claude McKay's poem in his own voice and in his own words.
If We Must Die is the poem that makes me a poet among colored Americans. If we must die, let it not be like hogs, hunted and penned in an inglorious spot, while round us bark the mad and hungry dogs, making their mock at our accursed lot. If we must die, oh, let us nobly die, so that our precious blood may not be shed in vain. Then even the monsters we defy shall be constrained to honor us though dead. O kinsmen, we must meet the common foe. Though far outnumbered, let us show us brave, and for their 1,000 blows deal one death blow. What though before us lies the open grave? Like men, we'll face the murderous, cowardly pack, pressed to the wall, dying but fighting back.
In the late 1800s, Omaha, Nebraska was a booming western city that was soon to become #1 in the world in livestock meat production. In the early 1900s, nearly 80% of Omaha's population of an estimated 125,000 people had livestock-related jobs. These workers were primarily of European descent, and from 1910 to 1919, their participation in labor strikes and the First World War left many vacancies at the meat packaging plants. To fill the void, company owners vigorously recruited blacks in the southern states. There were ads in papers in Omaha and throughout the South that beckoned blacks to come north to better wages and living conditions. The wages that blacks were paid at the Omaha plants were lower than white workers, but it was significantly more money than they could earn in the South. Hundreds of blacks began to replace white plant workers, and by 1915, a burgeoning black community was established near the meat packaging plants in South Omaha and the near north side of the city. A new African American newspaper called the Monitor began circulation in the summer of 1915. The Monitor was published weekly with news stories, columns, and advertising that was vital to establishing a strong sense of community among blacks in Omaha. By 1920, over 10,000 African Americans were living in Omaha. Because of the rapid growth in the African American population and employment situations at the meat packaging plants, racial tension began to build in Omaha. This tension culminated in the summer of 1919, when one plant worker in particular met a horrible fate.
This was the period of red hot summer. This was the period where about that what it is, you'd already had the riots in St. Louis, other places. And now you're having them in Omaha. What happened was they had a woman say that she had been molested or had been sexually abused by a black man. And that's all that needed to be said.
On September 25, 1919, Agnes Lobeck identified 40-year-old Will Brown as the man who attacked her. Brown was then arrested and taken to the Douglas County Courthouse. Before Brown was even identified, a civic storm was already brewing in Omaha due to a series of inflammatory stories published in the Omaha Bee and struggles for political power between racketeer Thomas Dennison and Omaha's mayor Edward Smith.
What's interesting is that the mayor attempted to keep them from taking Will Brown out of jail, and he suffered from an inch of his life being taken from him. And that was really the intent from the very beginning, to really kill him, as well as to bring about the racial tension even more so.
On the evening of September 28, 1919, a crowd of an estimated 5,000 to 10,000 people gathered outside the Douglas County Courthouse and demanded that Brown be handed over to them. Inside the courthouse, a frightened judge and other prisoners sent a note down to the crowd, saying that they would surrender Brown. The bloodthirsty crowd could not wait and rushed into the courthouse to seize Brown. Once in the hands of the crowd, Brown was beaten, hung from a lamppost, and shot more than 100 times. Actor Henry Fonda, at the time just 14 years old, witnessed the horrendous event from a second-story window at his father's printing company across the street from the courthouse. The ghastly melee ended with the burning of Will Brown's body. An Omaha World Herald photographer captured one of the most infamous photographs in American history. After the riot, federal troops were called in, and for 2 days, Omaha was under martial law. Even though over 100 people were arrested in connection with the riot and the murder of Will Brown, no one was charged. For Omaha's black community, an editorial picture published in the Monitor spoke volumes. Will Brown was buried in 1919 in an unmarked grave in Powder's Field at Forest Lawn Cemetery in Omaha. 90 years later, in July of 2009, a man from Riverside, California, Chris Hebert, who has no ties to the city of Omaha and has never visited before, was moved to pay $450 of his own money for a marker for Will Brown's grave. Hebert said that he watched a special on actor Henry Fonda, which mentioned the riot and how it affected his life and his acting career. Hebert also said that he hopes people will stop by the headstone and reflect on what happened to Will Brown in 1919, so that we may never let ourselves sink again to this level of inhumanity.
It was 1919, and the Delta was a killing ground. Back in 1919.
Amid the vast cotton fields in the Mississippi Delta region of East Arkansas is an obscure town called Elaine. Its past is so controversial that people are afraid to talk about it generations later.
There is a palpable, you can feel the hatred.
In 1919, one of the country's worst racial massacres occurred in Elaine, Arkansas. Although what happened that fateful night is not entirely certain, it's clear that shots were exchanged between blacks and whites at an African-American church in Hoop Spur, not far from Elaine. Sharecroppers were holding a meeting in the church when gunfire erupted outside. One white man and an unspecified number of blacks died that night. In the days that followed, 4 whites and multiple blacks would die. The number remains in dispute.
I guess I was about 10 years old when that happened. And I remember how frightening everybody was. And they was talking about this Elaine Red. And they were saying that the people was going to come up in our territory and take all the ammunition from the black folks. Said they was going to take every kind of gun they found.
Professor John Graves of Henderson State University in Arkansas discussed the involvement of the Army in his book, Town and Country.
When the soldiers arrived in Elaine, they found the town in an uproar with hundreds of armed white men in the streets. The troops' commander, Colonel Isaac Jinks, immediately ordered everyone in Elaine, black and white, disarmed. The Army came in and rounded up the supposed black insurrectionists, hundreds of them. By doing so, it did actually certainly engage in repression, but it also protected them from the local whites who were basically running wild at the time.
To hide from the U.S. Army troops and white mobs, black sharecroppers and their families hid in nearby cotton and sugarcane fields, swamps, or other homes, or deep in the woods, hoping to escape the advancing mobs. A former mayor of Elaine, Lamar Marks, believed that the number who died in Elaine in 1919 was much less than reported. He also believed that blacks started the violence based upon their unsubstantiated fears.
What was really the cause of all of it, I think, was the man that owned the farm claimed more of the cotton. They were supposed to get a half. They wouldn't give him quite that much. They'd sell it, give him a cheaper price for it. And that's where the thing all started out.
It will not be easy for the descendants of the Elaine riot victims to forgive or forget. Published accounts about what happened in Elaine are important, but the need for dialogue continues, and until it happens, reconciliation will be difficult and perhaps impossible.
The wound has to be opened, the wound has to be cleansed, and then, and only then, can you apply the balm, the sweetness, the healing process. But if it is not opened, something some hardened matter will exist below the surface. And in communities, we now begin to understand that that hardened matter, that resentment, that wound, in fact, that was never really properly cleaned, gets passed from generation to generation. And people sometimes don't understand where their own hostility and resentment and pain comes from until they really discover that it does relate very much to events in the past.
A meaningful dialogue would focus on the scarred past as well as the conditions necessary for shared prosperity in the future. But without meaningful dialogue and action, Elaine's past is destined to control its future. I'm Linda Green. Thanks for joining me.
As quickly as black families moved into neighborhoods, white families moved out. In just a few years, many all-white neighborhoods became all-black neighborhoods.
About 1912, I had an excuse to want to come to Chicago to see my mother. And they would say no because they was afraid that if I came here, I'd want to stay as a child naturally.
Dr. Marjorie Stewart Joyner moved to this neighborhood in 1917.
I remember the time when I was on one of the finest Pullman trains that ever went out of Chicago, the Texas Eagle, going west. When you got to Cairo, right here in Illinois, you had to pick up your grip and walk back to the Jim Crow car. It didn't bother me then as much as when I think of it now.
For both whites and blacks in Chicago, the years during World War I were prosperous. The city grew tremendously, but housing construction nearly stopped during the war. When the soldiers returned home in 1919, competition for both housing and jobs became fierce and ugly. There were bombings in black neighborhoods. Black workers were beaten. And on a hot day in July 1919, when a black swimmer wandered onto a section of whites-only beach, a bloody riot started.
A fellow by the name of Eugene Williams was swimming at 29th Street Beach, and some white guys decided that he had crossed an imaginary line, and so they decided to stone him. And so they stoned him and killed him. Okay, this set off the ride. The ride must have lasted 5 or 6 days.
They fought with fists, they fought with switchblade knives, they fought with pistols, they fought with sawed-off handguns. What would you do if somebody was going to take your life? Whatever you had, you'd used it.
Not since the Great Fire 50 years earlier had Chicago seen such destruction. By the time government troops restored peace, 38 men and boys, 23 of them black, were dead. More than 500 people, mostly black, were injured. Yet, despite everything, the riot, the racism, the terrible housing conditions, the huge black migration from south to north continued into the 1920s.
Well, let me set the background a little bit. It was July 27th of 1919. So in post-war Chicago, there were tens of thousands of soldiers who were returning from the fields in Western Europe. And there was a real crunch as far as jobs were concerned. It was a hot summer. There'd been some racial tension prior to the incident, on Sunday, July 27th, 1919. On that particular day, an 11-year-old black kid named Eugene Williams, who just graduated from grammar school, was floating on a raft off the 25th Street Bridge, the 25th Street Beach in Chicago. Now, there's always an imaginary line between the black beach at 25th Street and then the beach at 29th Street, where white people congregated. So there's an imaginary boundary there, and nobody would dare venture across that. Well, Eugene's raft just happened to float up past that imaginary line off the 29th Street Bridge at the beach. A white man named George Stauber had walked out onto the jetty off the beach and started throwing rocks at Eugene Williams. One of the rocks hit him in the head, which knocked him unconscious. At that point, he slid off the raft and drowned. Well, a lot of black people who had witnessed this became enraged, to say the least, and they approached a white police officer, whose name was Callahan, and demanded that Officer Callahan arrest George Stauber for what he had done. Callahan refused. And at that point, the crowd became even more enraged and rushed Callahan. At that point, Officer Callahan cried out for help, and a bunch of white men on the beach came to his rescue, and at that point, all hell broke loose, and rioting started. And it spread quickly, all the way from the 29th Street Beach, all the way west to the stockyards, which is a considerable distance. When my great-grandfather had heard that a number of black men had been killed in the riots, he was also told that there was a large number of blacks trapped at the stockyards by these white mobs who were going to kill him. So he also was told that the Chicago Police Department wasn't doing anything. They were not trying to cross through the white mobs that had surrounded the black workers inside this building to try and rescue them. So at that point, he put on a Chicago Police Department uniform that he had obtained. He also commandeered a Chicago Police Department paddy wagon with the big panel truck paddy wagons, can't see inside, and drove out to the stockyards. He then commenced to drive through the white mobs into the stockyards and filled that paddy wagon with as many black workers as he could and drove back through the lines repeatedly until he had gotten every one of those black workers out of that building they were trapped in. So there's no question in my mind that the death toll would have been a lot higher during those riots. I mean, 25 blacks and 15 whites had lost their lives, and over 500 people were seriously wounded. It just, I think, shows the depth of his courage in trying to do the right thing and protect his constituents, that he would take it upon himself to risk his life repeatedly to do just that.
So in honoring those heroes and heroines who so valiantly and courageously fought in the defense of their own liberties that you and I happen to enjoy today, we owe you a great debt. You penned your story in blood, and the history still speaks through the annals of time. So though we pause at this time to tribute and salute and honor you, if if we are still and silent long enough, we can hear your voices speaking to us and telling us to pick up the mantle for which you started. You started the fight that still remains, a fight that's worth fighting. And we honor your legacy in continuing to do so. So thank you, 19. To you.